Listen, in Tailwind CSS, there's an incredibly useful concept called pseudo-classes. A new development in the Tailwind space are Tailwind signals. They build on top of that really useful principle of pseudo-classes and take it a lot further. You can do some pretty wild stuff with Tailwind signals, and that all while writing really clean code. Now, Tailwind signals build off one of the coolest features I think Tailwind has, and that is the principle of groups versus peers. If two divs are on the same level, both of them are the first child, the top level child of the fragment element we have up here. In that case, what we call this relation is a peer relation because they are on the same level. If one div was nested inside of the other, right? In this scenario, this would be called a group relation. And both of these can actually be styled very, very similarly. For example, in the group relation, we can give the top level div a class name of group and then style the children accordingly. For example, by saying group hover, and then we can apply any class name that we want, right? And if we now hover this div, something changes on the child. Similarly, if we had a peer relationship where both divs are on the exact same level, we could declare one as a peer and then handle class name changes based on that peer on the other one. Like for example, peer hover, and then you apply the class name that you want. Like for example, a background change, background red 500. And now when you hover the first div, the class name of the second div changes, and that's without any kind of JavaScript. And Tailwind signals built on top of that principle. Now, they are highly experimental, right? They're not supported in every browser yet, unfortunately, but they do look super promising and they solve a really important problem. That is, they enable a custom state which can then be consumed by any of its descendants in the DOM. And all that descendants means here is children. So this would be a descendant of the top level parent div. So here, under the usage, which problems do signals actually solve? And we can take a look at one of the most simple examples to get a feel for this. Let's create an input element. The type is going to be email, and let's create a div element right below that. And now, without any JavaScript, I'm gonna demonstrate what I just talked about. We can give this a class name, and that will react to the state of the input without any JavaScript. The input will get a class name of peer, and that allows us to now listen to states of that input in CSS only. For example, by using peer invalid, if the input has an invalid input, we can now style this div element accordingly. For example, by actually showing it, and by default, it should be hidden. And this div is gonna say invalid input. If we save that and then go ahead into our Vite project and type anything here, as long as this is not a valid email, we're gonna get invalid input. But if we change this to be an actual valid email, like anything at gmail.com, well, we are actually hiding this div element. This idea is exactly what these signals built on top of, and I think they do a really good job at that. Let's clear all of this. Let's take a look at an example together, and that's gonna make it very clear what the signals do for us. So in this example, let's change this to class name to work with React. We have an input element and we are using the peer class to conditionally style this nested div right here. So basically we are forwarding the event. When this input is checked, we listen to the state change, the peer change on the top level div element. And then in this element, we say when the peer is checked, go into the current selector, that's what the and symbol is for, into the div, and then apply a class name of bggreen800 to it. So this div is actually the one that will be styled. We are just forwarding the event from the top level div into the child to achieve this effect in plain Tailwind. And you might be able to tell from this example, there's a problem with this because we are selecting this div very explicitly. What if we have multiple divs now? What if anything changes about our DOM? Won't this break our application? And the answer is yes, actually it will. Because we introduced a new div right here, the top level div is no longer valid. It doesn't anymore address this div right here, but instead the and div, the current selector, and then one div into it will now address this div and obviously not apply the styles accordingly. So while you can get this to work by then going in and addressing the second div, and you need to do the same thing in every place where you have this, then save it and then it works again, right? Because we manually fixed it. That's not a really clean approach to styling your app. Anytime you introduce any new element or change your DOM structure, you're gonna have the exact same problem, and you'll need to remember where to go and what to change. And that's exactly the problem that signals solve. So let's say we had a top level div right here. What we can now do, according to the example right here, is give this a class name of peer checked and then activate something called a signal. And this signal, that's the interesting part, we can now listen to in any depth of the DOM. So any children, it doesn't matter how nested it is, can now get a class name where we listen to that signal. And then we apply the class name accordingly, like a bg green of 500. And as long as we now have some text in here, like hover over me, and of course, this needs to be peer checked. There we go. We can see that, hey, the same thing works now. We can listen to the same event, but in any depth, in any child, no matter how nested it is, right? Because we activated the signal right here that we can now listen to. Now, the interesting thing is this also works the other way around. Currently, we have a child and we have a parent. And once the parent is, for example, checked, we are listening to that state change in the child and change the class name accordingly, right? So when the parent changes, the child gets a class name. This also works the exact other way around. When the child gets, for example, checked, or when the child is invalid, what I showed you in the very beginning, we can check that now in the parent. So the entire logic is reversed. So imagine this setup. We have a top level div, and this is going to get a class name of has invalid signal. So if any child inside of this div is invalid, for example, the input of type email that we saw in the very beginning, in that case, right, we can have a second div at the same level of the input, but notice the input is not declared as a peer. This input doesn't get any kind of class name. All work is done by the parent, and we can listen to that in the child, right, by applying a class name of signal. That's how we listen to the signal, and then which style we want to apply if this condition we have in the class name of the parent is true. So if the email that the user input is invalid, we can now listen to that change in our div right here and overwrite the BG green of 800 that it gets by default with a BG red of 800. And if we apply some of the other class names, we can see pretty much the same logic as we had before, but in a really nice kind of way. So if we now input John right here, that's not a valid email. We're gonna get a red background. But if the email is valid, like john@gmail.com, without any kind of JavaScript, TypeScript, React logic, none of it, just pure CSS like this, we get some seriously good logic for our input that we can display to the user. And that's exactly the point of signals. That's what they are for. Now, you need to be kind of careful in some cases, right? Because this does allow you to actually have circularity issues. If your child depends on the parent, but the parent also depends on the child, well, you're kind of cooked, right? That's a circular kind of dependency, I guess, and that's gonna basically cause you problems. One other thing you need to keep in mind is that this is experimental, what I mentioned in the very beginning, because it does rely on style queries, and style queries are not yet at least supported in every browser. Now, in most of them, yes, but Safari and Firefox don't have it yet, but are actively working on support for it. They've begun implementing style queries in their development versions, so it's only a matter of time, but it is a matter of time. They don't exist quite yet. Hey, I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's unfortunate that this is not supported on all browsers yet. I would love to see this on all browsers. I really think this is so much nicer than the plain Tailwind kind of way of writing things. What do you think about Tailwind signals? Is it something that you're already gonna use? Are you gonna wait until it's better supported? I would love to hear your thoughts, and then that's gonna be it for this video. I'm gonna see you in the next one. Until then, have a good one, and bye bye.